Hello everyone who is watching this series today. I want to pass my special regards to you for keeping in touch, making sure that you keep learning from this channel. I appreciate you so much. So today is our beginner series 004, and as you can see on the slide that is presented, we are talking about piling, concrete works, reinforcement, and formwork measurements. We are still discussing the rules, so that let me make a link to the previous sessions that we've done. We started by introducing what the course is, that is now the quantity surveying. Then we now go to the rules. So we are still much into discussion of the rules which are used in measurements, or also called building construction estimation. So these rules will be able to guide us through, will be able to give us the right way to do to take through our measurements, and also other building construction estimation. So first and foremost, before we begin now the beginner series 004, I told you my name is Baxton Ochieng, and from this channel of construction and quantity surveying tutoring channel, we learn construction, we learn also quantity surveying in more specific way and in more detailed way that you will not find in any other platform. So in this channel, we also cover broad varieties of measurements, including including coverage of the domestic rules within Eastern Africa. We are also covering other rules of measurements in other various parts of the world, including new rules of measurements, SMM2, and so on, including Malaysia. We've done some in Oman. So all those have been covered, and they are well explained in an extent that you are not going to find it in any other place. That gives you a better reason of keeping in touch, making sure that you learn with me in every bit of the way. So please, before we move even further, kindly click the subscription button. Make sure that you keep the channel growing. You have every notification coming on as soon as the content that is meant for you to learn has been in place. So please do me that one favor, click the subscription button, and then we start our session for today. Yeah, hoping that you have made your subscription. We want to talk about rules of measurements in regards to piling today, and also concrete works. So that is what we are intending to cover at the end of the day, at the end of the session. Hopefully it's complete within this particular session. If it's not complete, then we'll have to carry it forward to the next session, because it's quite broad. And trust me, it's very interesting. It has got things that are real, things that are elements which you must have interacted with at one particular time. Definitely, because it talks about concrete work, and concrete work comes from foundations, comes from columns, beams, and all those. So certainly those are items that you must have come across in one way or another. So today we are talking about section E of the standard methods of measurements, and from section E, this is what we have. We are talking about piling. So just a brief introduction, the way we normally do it, and then we explain the rules, summary of the rules that are there, and then we go, if you can see, an elaboration of the bills of quantities, so that we all blend in all the items that we have, so that it makes more sense to us. Now, when you talk about piling, piling is basically a type of foundation, especially driven into the hard surface. I mean, into the hard subbase that is able to contain that given load that is subjected to it. So that is basically what is piling. The types can be, we can have concrete piles, we can have timber piles. So all those piles, they have a way of being measured, because our intention here, that the reason we are discussing these rules is that we are able to know how do you conduct those particular measurements, so that we are able to do it in the right way. So the unit of measurement of piling that we are going to see is linear meters, okay, especially now the concrete piles. So we can discuss about the linear meters, and then we discuss now we describe and state now the diameter or the size of that particular piling. So I want just to move to from our display, that is now the slide, that is the slides to the top of the screen. You can see there is a presentation there to the side. Those are 3 piles. So that is how piles look like, and of course much of the design is based on the advice of the structural engineer. So once that has been advised, then now you as a quantity surveyor, you simply need to know that you have idea that these are the piles, and then this is how I'm supposed to measure it, and of course ultimately be able to price it, so that you have that estimated cost for that particular conducting that particular work. So that being said, we've said that piles can be of wood, they can also be of concrete, and generally you do them in linear meters, and also describing the size in which that particular pile is occurring. So then there are other items, of course, when you are conducting such items for such works like driving in a pile. Then there are those piles that you can have in form of precast, or those that you can have made in molds. So molds act like formwork. So in that case, then some of them you will assume that for molds you'll assume that the molds are deemed to be included within that particular pricing. So especially when you are now describing that particular pile, then you just would work on the linear meter. Now the mold which now led to the formation of that particular shape of the pile is deemed to be part of it. So you have to include your pricing within that particular description of that particular pile. Okay, yes. And then there are other items. For instance, now when for example now you're making what we call cast in situ concrete. So for cast in situ concrete, then other items like the reinforcement bars. Reinforcement bars, you will now measure them separately, and then the separate, according to the rule now for that is going to apply for measurement of our rebar here, falls under what we call reinforcement in concrete work. That is now what is coming in section F of the standard methods of measurement. So all that taken into consideration, that you should be at par, and you should be with ease measure your piling, and in whichever way it occurs, as per section E of the standard methods of measurements. Then there is another variety of piling that is now called the steel sheet piling. So for steel sheet piling, then you do it in square meters. Yes, now you understand that they will have to be those heavy gauge, especially now when maybe you are trying to separate some, especially in let me say wet areas, or areas that has got a lot of water. So you will have those sheet piles, especially when you want to separate one section of the work to the other. Then normally you can use those heavy gauge sheet pilings. So for such measurements, then you do them in square meters. Then that said, so we come to close to the piling, which is section E. Let's just see if in case there is anything that we are missing out. We've talked about linear meters. Yeah, they're the types of piles. We've said wood and the concrete piles. So that is said and well explained. And we don't have any other thing. We've also talked about sheet piling. So we also need to make our case for the next item, and that next item is what we call now the concrete. So for the concrete, let's see what we have. For concrete, we now have this is under section F, and that is what we are covering next. So generally, the reason I told you that concrete is quite broad, and in most cases you are certain that you've come across items that are from concrete, ranging from the foundation, ranging from columns, ranging from beams, because being the structural element of the construction, building houses, then in most cases it's adopted and you will come across it in one way or another. So you can just see some of the presentations, workings. Now that is trying to pour concrete in place, mix it, and so on, so that you just have to, you can relate what we are talking about. So this takes us to, when however much we are focusing on measurements and building estimation, then we really need to understand these items, because when you understand them before doing the actual estimation, then it's easier because you now understand what exactly you are dealing with. So when you are dealing with concrete, you've understood that concrete is this and this. You can fully describe it. So that means you are able to now get the prices or the cost for these constituent items that is making up the concrete. So in that manner, it's easier for you to even estimate, even give a full description in terms of mixes and so on. So concrete, from the description, is just simply a constituent of products of we have cement, we have sand, coarse aggregate, and water that are mixed in different ratios, which we are going to see in the next slide. So in that case, then it means there are ratios depending on the required strength for a particular job, okay, and particular purpose of that concrete. So you mix the constituent that we've talked about in a given ratio. So when that you build them in that ratio, then of course it means that will also influence the cost and definitely the pricing that you're going to give when you're doing your bills of quantities. Okay. So types that we have for types of concrete that are available include, I'll talk about cast in situ concrete. Now that is now the concrete that is now done at the place that is intended to. It's intended to be used. For instance, you just mix it the way, for example, the way we've done. You are seeing here. So you are mixing it here, then you pour it there. Now that is now what you call cast in situ concrete. So then there is another one also called, so under the in situ concrete, we can have vibrated reinforced concrete and mass concrete. So mass, you can also refer to it as a plain concrete. So it's simply mass or plain because it does not have anything to do with reinforcement bit. Unlike now the vibrated reinforced concrete that you have to include the rebars within it, and apart from the rebar, then you have to vibrate it so that it maintains it acquires that sufficient strength that is needed. Type 2 is now the precast concrete. Now the concrete that is done off the site. You do it in a particular plant, maybe in a concrete manufacturing plant. So you do it, you've already done so, and then you now bring it and use it. You can use it, for example, can have precast concrete coping, or a precast concrete window board or window sill, so to say. And then you can also have pre-stressed concrete. Now this is concrete that has been subjected to certain level of tension, okay, so that it requires, especially for special use. So you subject it to such a certain levels of tension, especially to the rebars, specially done, and then after that you now have your concrete. So from there you can bring that concrete to a given use that is intended for one reason or another. So we also have the forms of provision of that in situ concrete. in situ concrete, you don't have to mix it on site, okay? But being that it's still wet, brought in wet form, you can also have a ready mix concrete. So ready mix concrete, it's done, especially done, the mixing, the ingredients are done off the site, especially when you have limitations of certain limitations on site, like space. You can do what you call the ready mix concrete. So once you've done your ready mix concrete, then you bring it on site to a specific point that you want to use it. Then you can also have the hand mix, just mixing it right there, just for smaller uses and so on. Then we now have mixing using the concrete mixer, as it's been presented in that particular slide. So let's just walk through, see what's next here. This is also a reinforced concrete work. They're now doing what you call pouring now, putting the concrete in place, and then you just vibrate it with hand as they are doing, okay? So then they spread it, especially for smaller uses, that is just okay. Then we'll go to now, these are now the ratios. You remember when we were discussing the description of concrete, we talked about ratios of concrete. So these are the mixing, the composition. So when you talk about a class or a grade of concrete, then there's a particular composition to it. So when you talk about class 10, then that is a composition of 1 to 4 to 8. You talk about class 15, then composition of that is 1 to 3 to 6. Class 20 is 1 to 2 to 4. Class 25 is 1 to 1.5 to 3, and then 30 is 1 to 1 to 2, and then 35 is 1 to 1 also to 2. So those given compositions will be able to give you a particular. So for instance, when you're using a particular class of concrete, definitely class 10 and 15, for instance, is mostly applicable for what you call the plain concrete, especially now when you want to do items like blinding, elements like blinding. So in that case, the prices for such items are lower than the prices for the classes which are up above them. So you understand that because of these ratios, the ratios directly affect the constituents of material that are in place. So when they do affect the constituents of materials in place, then it means, and the prices are directly proportional to the prices, okay, the materials that you have. So when you have, especially when you have a lower ratio, like a ratio of 20, where you just have 1 piece of cement to 2 pieces of sand, then to 4 pieces of coarse aggregate, it's definitely going to be lower than where you have 1 piece of cement, then 1.5 pieces of sand, and then 3 pieces of coarse aggregate, in that order. The reason is those items are directly related to the materials, directly impact on the cost, and ultimately the rates, the prices that we're going to use for our rates. Okay, that said, then we now have to relate what we have here. Now what the rules, what the rule is talking about in terms of measurement, and then we are now going to relate it with a typical work done in terms of bills of quantities. So let's see what the rule says about that. Then generally we have different elements of concrete that is used. So for instance, we've talked about that class 15 or class 10 of plain concrete. So in that case, generally we do it in square meters. I want just to show you from the bills of quantities. Talking of the plain concrete, for instance, here we've talked about class 15, and as I've said, class 15 can be of the ratio, in bracket we talk about ratio of 1 to 3 to 6, in that order. So as you do your concrete work for every instance, then you have to fully describe. You can talk about class, or you can talk about combination of both class and also the ratio. in which the constituents of the concrete have been mixed. So once you have that in place, you give your full description, and then you talk about thickness. You can see you're talking about 50 millimeters thick. So when you refer to the standard methods, then you will notice that you do it in square meters, okay, for the plain in situ concrete that has been done for blinding. Just take you to blinding, concrete blinding. So once you have that, so blinding, we've just noted, we do it in we'll do the blinding in square meters. Of course, now when we'll be coming to actual takeoff and measurements, then you'll be able to see how you come about with the square meters depending on what you're dealing with. Is it blinding for column bases, or is it blinding for strip footing, and so on. So we'll also come to measure how you do that in actual way, and then how you input your prices, you do everything so that you have appropriate bills of quantities. Now you see that, then we go to now the vibrated reinforced concrete, which I also mentioned as part of the cast in situ concrete. So for the vibrated reinforced concrete, then you can have it in various parts of the house. You can have them, for instance, you do have them in the pad foundation, you can have them in the strip footing, in the stab columns. Now the columns at the substructure level. Then you can have them in ground beams, concrete bed, and slab thicknessing. So all those are done in cubic meters, especially even including the concrete bed can be done in cubic meters when it reaches a threshold, and that threshold is 300 millimeters. Okay, so you measure pad foundation in cubic meters, strip footing cubic meters, stab columns you also do in cubic meters, ground beams of course also in cubic meters, and for concrete bed there is an exemption, except you can do it in square meters up to 300. Okay, done in square meters up to 300 millimeters thick. So before it reaches 300 millimeters thick, then you are not allowed to. You're supposed to do it in cubic meters. So let me just show you that reference that we have. So here is the reference that you need to measure it in cubic meters until you need to measure it in square meters until it is that particular thickness, that is 300. So if you have 100, 150, 200 to 50 up to 300, do it in square meters. So 301 onwards, or even if you will have 300.5, then you will do that in cubic meters. So anything less, from 300 to the lower side, or 300 to anything below it, you do it in square meters. Okay, but then you have to describe the thickness of that particular concrete bed. So that is how the rule applies, and then that is how the rule is used for preparation of the bills of quantities. So definitely you see that these rules, they are related directly to how you are making your bills of quantities, because that is now the guidance. It's now what guides you on how to conduct your work. So just to make a little recap, then you have to understand what type of concrete you are using in terms of class or grade, and then you know the mixes, because the mixes you will come to see it later on in our later versions, that from the mixes then you are able to know components of the constituents that are used, and also their resultant prices, and then that also helps you to make now your decision in pricing that particular class of concrete, of having a rate in per cubic meter for that given particular class of concrete. So that will be so essential to understand and know that this class, this is what is going to be used. Even if you are now having your assumptions, at times you might not have the class specified. So whenever you're having your assumption, you will not definitely assume that you're using a class 10 or 15 for a part that is supposed to have a reinforced concrete. So that's why it's important that you have idea of what you're talking about, you have the proper knowledge, so that you are making that what we call a guided assumption towards a given item. So when you do have a guided assumption, it's easier for you, and you are able to make the right decisions in terms of assumptions and assumptions and taking off your measurements. So that brings us to the end of the concrete piling and concrete for the that we are talking about for our session now. And then we want to just blend it in with the next part, that is the reinforcement works. Okay, so reinforcement works, I would like us to cover reinforcement work in our next episode. Okay, so that we bring in we continue, make it a continuation of the piling concrete work, but then now as a part of the beginner series 005, so that we look into reinforcement works in details, and also we will now blend it reinforcement works, we blend it in together with the other bit of form work in that particular episode. So for now, as we conclude this particular session, I want to thank you all for watching, and I would urge you that if you find it so helpful, please make a subscription, because now we are building on top of every item that we are covering. We are building on and on until we now have a full broad scope of understanding of what we are talking about in terms of building measurements and building construction and measurements. So that brings us to the close of this session. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned, and please make a subscription. Thank you. Bye bye. See you in the next session.